Hi, and welcome to another episode of Pixorama, where tonight we're getting beachy.
With the and the fucking with the things and the summer with the fire and the whoa.
And by beachy I really mean, well, near the beach, under the ocean, under watery. It's funny, I was at home recently cleaning out my childhood bedroom because my folks have decided it's time to sell the family home. Of course, in this reimagining, they're not Australian, but from the deep south. But I found a heap of stuff that I'd sketched and drawn that I'd made when I was younger. And one of them was a sketch of the character which I'm about to pixel. At the end, we'll see just how accurate my brain can be. Anyway, we're diving straight in here, and as you can see, I'm building the head/body of this octo-creature, this Octo-Cupcake. It kind of reminded me of a cupcake with that pink thing on his head. So I started out by drawing 2 discs, and then I extended them down to give them kind of a Michelin Man puff, kind of a marshmallowy sort of puffiness. I then added some shadows down here, give it some shadow detailing, make it pop a little bit. And of course,
how are you gonna eat all them fish?
Without a mouth. That is of course assuming that he or she is a carnivore and not a vegetarian. Shift that mouth up a little bit, I was looking a little too low. And now we're going to give the whole shape a bit more depth by putting a little highlight on the top. As that strange 1930s radio voice likes reminding us.
Always remember where your light source is coming from.
Yes, indeed. That's very important. And in this case, I think you can tell that the light source is coming from above. Thus, we have the highlights on the top of the shape and the shadows underneath. Let's give his eyes a bit more character here, little highlights there. And zooming out, we can see that it's time to move on to the next part, which is the tentacles of our little octo-creature. As with any well-behaved little octo-creature, he has, 8 arms. So we're going to do them one by one. But don't worry, I will save you the pain by zipping into turbo mode. For the most part. But here at the beginning, we're going to go at a humanly comprehensible speed, just to illustrate the shading here, giving that tentacle a nice shadow underneath and some highlights on the top as well. Makes it look a little more like a wet object if there's shiny highlights. Wet objects often tend to have very defined highlights, and they're quite contrasty usually. And now we're entering the fabled turbo mode, and you can see the rest of the legs coming in here. And where I'm happy and not happy with how they turned out, I think I raised a couple of them a few times. And the shading following the lead from that first tentacle, we're doing the shading underneath, of course, because the light's coming from above. And don't forget to save your project. And now let's finish off those last couple of legs. And there's also quite a good select and move process in this app. I quite like how it's done. You basically just drag to add to your selection, your current selection, with the select tool. And then you can move it with the move tool. It's one of the many things I like about this app, and one of the small things as well. It's very important when you have complex workflows like this one to have the little details right. I think this app pretty much nails it. So I'm just finishing off some last little details on the tentacles here and adding the final tentacle. I had to move the others in to make space for it. And then I decide, he's rather boring. What can I do to make him more interesting? Oh, I know, I'll cut off one of his hands. And give him a hook. Swing! It's a nice shiny hook. He's obviously been taking care of his hook. He's been polishing it in preparation, of course, for the great Octo-Cupcake ball, in which one must dress to impress. Now I give him some suction cups, some little fluoro green suction cups, because I thought they looked kind of funky. And back to his head again. It's kind of, I'm picturing it as a see-through kind of membrane under which his brain might reside, so I'm making it shiny. And now let's go back to the face and give it some detailing, some shadows over the eyes and some highlights underneath, just to indent his eyes so they don't look like they're floating. And I couldn't quite decide if I wanted his pupils to be longer or shorter. I made them longer in the end. Some final detailing, some shadowing here on the tentacles and some highlights. And he's looking okay at the moment, but there's still much more work to be done. Let's extend his head a little bit, make it a little more rounded. And now I'm going to adjust the background because that color just wasn't doing it for me. But first let's put in some seaweed, which he will be clasping in many of his little tentacles there. I'm going to weave the seaweed in front and behind of his tentacles to really play with the depth in this scene, because we have that opportunity here. It's going to look kind of cool if he's all tangled up in these watery tendrils with his tendrils. So that's what I'm going to do. Also, having all these voluminous strands of vegetation allows us to frame the image. As you can see, I put two big strands at the sides of the image, and that really helps to frame the whole piece, as well as the ones down the bottom, and it helps direct attention as well. Helps move the focus, shifts it to the character in the middle. So now we're going to move on to shading the strands of kelp or seaweed or whatever they are. I'm going to start, as I usually do, with the shadows before I do the highlighting. This is really just a personal preference. You could start with the highlights or do whatever you want. It's a free, I was going to say it's a free country, but I have no idea where you are. You may not be in a free country. Anyway, the shadows here, obviously this is another great opportunity to play with depth in the image. And as you can see, I'm using the shadows as an indicator of how far away these tentacles are from the seaweed. If they're quite close, then the shadows tend to be also quite close to the tentacles. And if the tentacles are further away, then the shadows will accordingly drop further onto the seaweed, further away. And as for their own shadows, I'm using some quite thick and some quite oddly shaped shadows on these strands of kelp. It's a great way of giving the illusion of depth. Using shadows, you can define curves and folds within the shape. You don't have to rely on the outline of the shape itself. So taking a break from the kelp and the Octo-Cupcake for a minute, let's add some bubbles. Not the right color for the bubbles, there we go. Make them sort of a light blue so they're not quite as stark. And we can also go back to the background, which I wanted to do before. And instead of just having a flat color, I would really like some sort of interest in the background. I'm not going to go overboard, but I'm thinking of having kind of a cave. Once again, also using that background to really frame the image and draw attention to the middle again. So there we have it. And now I'm just going to go and change the... I'm doing some color correction already. I probably shouldn't be. I probably should be doing that at the end. But sometimes that stuff irks me and I just want to get it done. So I'm changing the color of the kelp here, just making it a little more saturated. And I will do the same with the background, which I then and over for a while. Ended up changing it again anyway. Oops, I screwed up one of the strands of kelp, so I'm going to have to redo the shading on that. And having played around with the background, as I said, I will then go and change it to a completely different color scheme. Boop, there we go. Now let's focus on this head again. I'm going to bevel the edge here with a dark inner color and highlight the front to give it that indented feel. And now I'm going to change his little pads, his little suction cups, to a kind of a more interesting color. Just going to make them a nice pink, the same pink that we used for his head, keeping the palette consistent there. And I'm just going to take a moment here and really figure out his eyes, because they're still bugging me a bit. I'm going to make them a bit cuter, maybe give them a second tone, make them a little more cartoony and a little more anime. And then finally, I'm going to go in and put some highlights on these strands of kelp. Just, again, to make them look more aqueous, to give them a bit more of a wet feel. And keeping in line with our light coming from above rule, as ever, our golden rule. But these highlights are taking a bit of a different form. It's almost as if the caustics from the water above are kind of affecting them. They're longer and slimmer. And there we have it. Here is our little Octo-Cupcake in his final form. And I have to apologize, I did make a couple of small adjustments after what we just saw in the video, but unfortunately my recording didn't work. But basically these edits were just to enhance the contrast. For example, I made his eyelids a little darker, and around the corners of his mouth and the sides of his head, and so on. Nothing too game-changing. But I'm pretty happy with how this one turned out. I think it's a kind of a quirky little character. And now, as I said, this little sprite was done from memory from an image that I found in my bedroom while cleaning it out. So, as promised, let's have a look at the original image. Drum roll, please. Okay, that looks nothing like I thought I remembered. I think I got the main elements of it in some bizarro way, but I missed the claws, I missed those cool jelly tentacles, and I'm not sure which one I like better, but there you go, that's how good my memory is. So that's it for this tropical edition of Pixorama. As always, you can drop a comment below if you would like to see something in particular, and please leave me a like if you thought the video was cool, and subscribe to see more in the future. I'm Jimzip, thanks for watching.
Pixorama.
Pixorama.